First things first, what do you actually know about Rwanda? Because most people, when they hear the name, they only think of one thing, one dark chapter. And yes, we're going to talk about that later, but if that's all you know, you're missing about 1,000 years of a really important backstory. So let's back it up. Okay, at this point, we've seen a lot of history to know that one way or the other, the Europeans are going to show up. The question is, what was the country like before that? Well, in Rwanda's case, they already had a functioning kingdom, complete with a king, a military structure, cattle chiefs, land chiefs, and a population that lived in what historians describe as a kind of social balance. There's the Tutsi, the Hutu, and the Twa. While they were technically different groups, they weren't always enemies, and they weren't even really separate ethnicities in the modern sense. What they were was more like social roles, fluid ones that people could move between depending on how much cattle they owned. Then, of course, the Europeans meddled. In 1884, European powers sat down in Berlin, carved up an entire continent on a map, and handed Rwanda to Germany. The Germans didn't understand the place, didn't really bother to, and ruled through whoever was already at the top. In Rwanda, that meant the Tutsi monarchy. See, after World War I, Germany lost its colonies and Belgium practically took over. That's when things started to get darker. How? Well, you have to understand that the Belgians didn't just rule through the Tutsi elite. They proactively made the divide worse. In other words, they looked at the Tutsi and the Hutu and decided these were two fundamentally different races. Physically, the Tutsi were taller on average, with different facial features. And by socio-economic standards, they were deemed more, quote-unquote, civilized. More European, so to speak. Because of that, they got access to education, government positions, and power. The Hutu, on the other hand, got the field work. And then in 1935, Belgium introduced identity cards. Every single person in Rwanda was now officially labelled Tutsi, Hutu, Twa. It was no longer about cattle or status or social movement. Now it was all written on a piece of paper you had to carry everywhere. And that was a massive mistake. While having identity cards might seem harmless, it actually cemented the tension, building deep resentment between these once fluid groups. By the late 1950s, that resentment reached a boiling point. In 1959, the Hutus rose up against the Tutsi elite and the Belgian rulers. It was a bloody revolution, and it led to over 150,000 Tutsis fleeing for their lives into neighbouring countries like Uganda, Burundi, and Zaire. So when independence finally came in 1962, Rwanda didn't just become free, it became a Hutu-dominated republic. The king at the time, Kigeri V Ndahindorwa, fled into exile, and the people who had been on top for centuries were now on the run. Over the next 3 decades, violence was the recurring theme. It came in waves in 1963, 1967, 1973. Each time more Tutsis were killed and more fled the country. By the mid-1960s, roughly half of Rwanda's entire Tutsi population was living outside its borders as refugees, meaning their children had to grow up in foreign lands, some in Uganda, others in Burundi, and the rest in Zaire. Then in 1986, some of those Rwandan refugees in Uganda joined a rebel army that successfully overthrew a Ugandan dictator. They became battle-hardened, incredibly disciplined soldiers. So when that war was over, they decided to form their own organisation. They called it the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. Their mission? To finally go home. In October 1990, the RPF invaded Rwanda from Uganda. Now, did they win right away? Not at all. The Rwandan government fought back hard, calling in French and Zahiran troops to back them up, and the initial RPF invasion was completely crushed. But they didn't give up. A new leader took over, a guy named Paul Kagame. He turned them into a brilliant guerrilla fighting force. For 3 years, they fought the government to a stalemate. Eventually, a ceasefire was reached in 1991 and peace talks dragged on. Finally, in August 1993, a deal was signed in Arusha, Tanzania. The Arusha Accords. It underlined exactly how power would be shared and how the refugees could finally return home. To ensure everything went smoothly, the UN sent peacekeepers into the capital, Kigali, to oversee it. And it looked for a split second like maybe it was actually going to work. Then on April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana's plane was shot out of the sky by a missile as it approached Kigali airport. Who did it? To this day, nobody knows for sure. Some blame the Tutsi rebels, others blame Hutu extremists who thought the president was giving up too much power in the peace deal. But whoever pulled the trigger, it was the spark. That same night, the killing started. Within hours, roadblocks went up across the city. Lists of names specifically targeting Tutsis and moderate Hutus had already been prepared. Soldiers and militias went door to door. Come morning, thousands were dead, and over the next 100 days, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were brutally murdered. As you can probably guess, most of them were Tutsi, though any Hutu who refused to participate or tried to help was not spared. Neighbours turned on neighbours. Teachers targeted their own students. A notorious radio station, Radio Mille Collines, literally broadcasted instructions on where people were hiding, calling Tutsis cockroaches and telling the public to clear the tall trees. It was total systematic chaos, and the worst part, the world watched. The United Nations initially had 2,500 troops on the ground, but they were instructed not to intervene. Once things got really bad, the UN actually pulled most of their troops out, leaving the victims defenseless. Ultimately, the international community didn't stop it. The RPF did. They fought their way across the country, captured Kigali, and by July the genocide was forced to a halt. What followed was a whirlwind of events. The extremist Hutu government fled into neighbouring Congo. The international trials began, and today, every year on April 7th, Rwanda begins Kwibuka, which means to remember. It is a sombre 100-day period of national mourning, simply because the country decided that forgetting the horrors that occurred is not an option. So it's only natural to think that this country that's gone through so much heartache would be defined by tragedy. But you'd be surprised. Rwanda sits just below the equator, right in the heart of Africa. It's landlocked on all sides by Uganda to the north, Tanzania to the east, Burundi to the south, and the Democratic Republic of Congo to the west. It covers about 10,169 square miles, or about 26,000 square kilometres. It's quite tiny, really. Yet, despite its size, an enormous amount of the world is packed inside it. They call it the land of 1,000 hills. Let me show you why. Check this out. The whole central plateau sits between 4,900 and 8,200 feet, or about 1,500 to 2,500 metres above sea level. Which sounds high, until you realise that's actually a relatively flat part. Up in the northwest, the Virunga Mountains push the ceiling even higher, all thanks to Mount Karisimbi, which towers at almost 15,000 feet, or about 4,500 metres. It's a dormant volcano, though it's not Rwanda's alone. It actually shares this with the DRC. And you know why this volcano is important? You couldn't tell from first glance, but it's actually home to something you can't see anywhere else on Earth, at least not at this scale. I'm talking about mountain gorillas. The Virunga region is home to a massive chunk of the world's remaining mountain gorilla population. It's so impressive, in fact, that people fly from all over the world just to spend an hour with them. And hey, if you want to do the same, by all means, go for it. I'll link incredible flight deals in the description so you can do just that. After you've got your fill, head to the west where you'll find Lake Kivu. Just a disclaimer though, while it looks peaceful, it's actually not. The lake sits on a volcanic rift and contains a shocking, deadly amount of dissolved carbon dioxide and methane. But don't worry, those raw materials aren't going to waste, because companies are already extracting that methane from the deep water to generate electricity. Of course, the risk is high. If the lake gets destabilised, it could trigger a massive limnic eruption, essentially a giant explosion of suffocating gas. But Rwanda's doing its best to keep everything calm and engineered safely. Now, if exploding lakes aren't your thing, there's a lot more that Rwanda offers. For instance, if you head south, you'll hit Nyungwe. It's one of the best preserved montane rainforests in Africa. It's home to 13 primate species, over 300 bird species, an ecosystem so intact it was officially designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Or continue east for a completely different atmosphere, because here, the hills flatten out into a classic savanna. The Akagera National Park runs along the Tanzanian border, a sprawling wetland and grassland system where lions, elephants, giraffes, and reintroduced rhinos now roam. Fun fact, it almost didn't survive the 1990s. After the war, the park was heavily reduced and overwhelmed by refugees returning with cattle. Luckily, it's been masterfully rebuilt since, and today, it's one of the most successful wildlife recovery stories on the continent. Though that's not the only thing that's successful about this country. The IMF just ranked it as one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, projecting a staggering 7.2% growth. For context, the global average is only hovering around 3%. So let me give you some context. After the nightmare of 1994, Rwanda had absolutely nothing. The infrastructure was entirely destroyed, the population was deeply traumatized, and up to 70% of the Tutsi population living inside the country had been wiped out. So in 2000, the government sat down and wrote something called Vision 2020. It was essentially a blueprint to completely rebuild the nation within 2 decades. New roads, schools, hospitals, a functioning digital economy, and a serious push to attract foreign investment. By most measures, it worked. Kigali, the capital, is consistently ranked the cleanest and safest city in Africa. And Rwanda even topped the baseline profitability index as the world's most attractive destination for foreign direct investment, beating out India, Malaysia, and shockingly, Qatar. That's all thanks to a calculated mix of services, construction, tourism, mining, and agriculture. To this day, coffee and tea remain major exports. That's because Rwanda's high-altitude, volcanic soil produces some of the most sought-after specialty coffee on the planet. On top of that, gold production has surged in recent years, and tourism, anchored by those guerrilla treks in the Virunga Mountains, pulls in serious foreign currency. But don't even get me started on the digital shift. A decade ago, most of Rwanda's informal economy ran entirely on cash. Today, motorcycle taxi drivers get paid through mobile wallets. Market vendors display digital payment QR codes. This movement has been so outstanding that the National Bank of Rwanda recently reported that old series banknotes now account for just 0.3% of total currency circulation. Which I know sounds like a boring stat, but wait till I tell you what that actually means. In simple terms, it means money is moving through formal, digital systems instead of sitting hidden under mattresses. That makes small businesses visible to lenders, trackable by the government, and integrated into the broader economy in a way that simply wasn't possible before. And the macro numbers back it up. Rwanda's exports skyrocketed by 63% in the first quarter of the year, narrowing the trade deficit by 23%. Because of that, the Rwandan franc has managed to stay remarkably stable. So yeah, you could say that through all of this, Rwanda is running a deliberate experiment. Can a small African nation transform itself into a middle-income tech hub within a single generation? Well, if we look at the numbers, they are pretty much pointing to yes. But you know what? Here's the thing about Rwanda that doesn't show up in the history books or the economic reports. After everything they went through, the country still has a culture that was never fully broken. And in a lot of ways, that culture is exactly what held things together when nothing else could. Take Umuganda, for instance. On the last Saturday of every month, everything stops. Literally, shops close, buses stop running, and Rwandans, whether they're farmers or high-ranking government ministers, go outside and clean, build, plant and fix things together. It's not optional either. On the contrary, it's a national tradition rooted in an ancient Kinyarwanda concept that translates roughly to coming together in common purpose. That same communal instinct, believe it or not, it runs through almost every single piece of art here. Take the Eichgaseke, those iconic woven baskets you see in every market. They aren't just for storage. They are traditionally woven by groups of women sitting together, talking through life. Or look at Imigongo geometric paintings, which were historically created by communities working together to beautify each other's homes. And then there's this. Rwandan filmmaker Mahrikle Mantin Dusabe Jambo made history by winning the prestigious Camera d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival for her breathtaking debut feature film, Beini Machna. And just so you understand how massive this is, that's the top global prize for a debut director. The film took over a decade to bring to life. It follows the gut-wrenching journey of women navigating trauma and reconciliation in the years after 1994, set against the raw backdrop of the Gacaca courts. those are the traditional community tribunals where neighbours became witnesses, judges, and sometimes the accused, right in front of each other. When accepting the award, Dusabe Jambo gave a deeply emotional tribute to the women of her country, pointing out that forgiveness isn't just an abstract idea, it's a practice. It has to be lived out and every single day. And that is Rwanda's deeper story. It's not just a tragedy, and it's not even the recovery. It's the incredibly difficult, profoundly human work of deciding how to rebuild a broken society from the ground up. The infamous ethnic labels that Belgium stamped onto paper back in 1935. They were completely banished. The identity cards were completely redesigned. Today, the country shares one culture. And the most beautiful takeaway here is that if you walk down the streets of Kigali and ask the younger generation who they are, they won't tell you they are Hutu or Tutsi. They will simply tell you, I am Rwandan. If that doesn't encompass the ultimate triumph of unity and community over division, I don't know what does. With that, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.